Los Angeles, 1985. People weren't afraid of ghosts. They were afraid to fall asleep. Every morning, another family was on the news. No pattern, no warning. Doors were locked, windows were shut. It didn't seem to matter. Neighbors started sleeping with baseball bats. Some kept their lights on all night. Others stayed awake until sunrise because they believed if they closed their eyes, they might not wake up. Police called him the Night Stalker. He entered homes while people slept, leaving entire neighborhoods terrified that they could be next. The scariest part, for months, nobody knew where he'd strike next. Imagine hearing a noise outside your bedroom window. In 1985, real case, real victims. Follow Red Frequency TV for the next episode of True Red Horror Files. They say evil has a face, but sometimes it doesn't. During the 1970s, a charming law student named Ted Bundy gained the trust of strangers with a smile, fake injuries, and a calm voice. Women disappeared across multiple states. Witnesses described the same man, handsome, polite, and driving a tan Volkswagen Beetle. Even after he was arrested, Bundy escaped custody. Not once, but twice. After his second escape, he committed one of the most horrifying attacks of his killing spree before police finally captured him for good. He later confessed to murdering more than 30 women, though investigators believe the real number may never be known. In 1989, Ted Bundy was executed. His case changed how police investigated serial killers forever, proving that monsters don't always look like monsters. Red Frequency TV, tomorrow's broadcast, another true crime case. Don't watch alone. Good evening. You're tuned into Red Frequency TV, True Crime, Red Files. Tonight's broadcast covers one of the most disturbing criminal cases in American history. Between 1978 and 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer murdered 17 victims, most of them young men, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Behind the image of a quiet neighbor was a man hiding a horrifying secret. Dahmer lured victims to his apartment, where investigators later uncovered evidence of his crimes. In 1991, one victim escaped and led police back to Dahmer's apartment. What officers discovered inside exposed the truth and ended one of the most infamous killing sprees in American history. Dahmer was arrested, convicted of multiple murders, and sentenced to life in prison. In 1994, he was killed by another inmate. But the question that still haunts investigators is this: how did someone commit these crimes for years while the people around him had no idea? This was Jeffrey Dahmer, one of the darkest cases ever recorded. They called him friendly. He volunteered at community events, entertained children as a clown, and smiled for every camera. But when the sun went down, something far darker waited inside his house. Between 1972 and 1978, young men kept disappearing around Chicago. Families searched. Police struggled to connect the cases. Then investigators entered John Wayne Gacy's home. The smell, the crawl space, It revealed one of the most horrifying crime scenes in American history. Authorities eventually linked Gacy to the murders of 33 young men and boys, many buried beneath his own house. His neighbors had no idea they had been living next door to a serial killer. Sometimes the monster doesn't hide in the shadows. Sometimes he waves at you from across the street. This has been Red Horror Files. True Red Horror Files, Episode 5, Theodore Kaczynski, The Cabin of Terror. Most serial killers hid in plain sight, but one man disappeared into the wilderness while carrying out one of the longest bombing campaigns in American history. His name was Theodore Kaczynski. Living alone in a small cabin deep in the Montana woods, he rejected modern society while secretly mailing homemade bombs across the United States. For nearly 18 years, his attacks targeted people connected to universities, airlines, and technology, leaving investigators searching for a suspect they couldn't identify. The FBI called him the Unabomber, launching one of the largest and most expensive manhunts in its history. The breakthrough didn't come from a fingerprint or DNA. It came from his own words. After a lengthy manifesto was published, Theodore Kaczynski's brother recognized the writing style and alerted authorities. When federal agents searched the isolated cabin, they found bomb-making materials, journals, and evidence that ended nearly 2 decades of terror. One tiny cabin, one man, and a nationwide campaign of fear. This wasn't fiction. It really happened. True Red Horror Files. Don't watch alone.
Red Horror Files, Episode 6, Aileen Wuornos. What if I told you one of America's most infamous serial killers claimed every victim attacked her first, and that, even today, people still debate whether parts of her story were true? Aileen Wuornos was a former sex worker who murdered 7 men across Florida between 1989 and 1990. After her arrest, she admitted to the killings but insisted she acted in self-defense, claiming each man had tried to sexually assault or kill her. Investigators, however, found evidence linking her to the murders and concluded they were not justified acts of self-defense. Her own girlfriend eventually helped police locate and arrest her. While on death row, Wuornos gave bizarre interviews, claiming the government was watching her, controlling her mind, and plotting against her. Her mental state appeared to deteriorate as her execution approached. In 2002, Aileen Wuornos was executed by lethal injection. To this day, her case remains one of the most controversial in true crime history, with people still debating how much of her story was truth and how much was the mind of a deeply troubled killer. This has been Red Horror Files. They say monsters hide in the dark. Sometimes they wear a church suit. They smile at their neighbors. This is the true story of Dennis Rader, the man who called himself BTK. Listen. On January 15, 1974, police arrived at a home in Wichita, Kansas. Inside, 4 members of the Otero family had been murdered. There was no clear motive, no suspect, no answers. But the killer wasn't finished. Over the next several years, more victims followed. He stalked them, learned their routines, then struck without warning. The killer craved attention. He mailed letters to newspapers, claiming responsibility. In one letter, he gave himself a name: BTK, bind, torture, kill. He believed he was smarter than police and mocked the investigation whenever he could. Then, he disappeared. For years, the murders stopped, and so did the letters. Many believed BTK was gone forever. The truth was far more disturbing. Dennis Rader had built a normal life. He was a husband, a father, a church leader, and worked as a city compliance officer. To everyone around him, he seemed completely ordinary. In 2004, after nearly 25 years of silence, Rader wanted attention again. He began sending letters to the media. Then he made one fatal mistake. He asked police if a floppy disk could be traced. They publicly said no. He believed them. When investigators examined the disk, hidden metadata led them straight to Dennis Rader. DNA confirmed it. On February 25, 2005, BTK was arrested after more than 30 years. The man who thought he was untouchable was finally caught. Not because he was outsmarted in the field, but because his own ego exposed him. True Red Horror Files. Ed Gein. Most serial killers hide their crimes. Ed Gein kept them. He lived alone on an isolated farm outside Plainfield, Wisconsin. Neighbors described him as quiet, polite, awkward. Nothing about him seemed dangerous. But after his older brother died under mysterious circumstances and his controlling mother passed away, something inside him broke. For years, people around Plainfield began disappearing. Most assumed they had simply left town, until one cold November day in 1957, a local hardware store owner named Bernice Worden vanished without a trace. There were signs of a struggle, a trail of blood. The cash register was empty. The last customer recorded in the store's receipt book was Ed Gein. Police drove to his farmhouse that same evening. The property looked abandoned, dark, silent, almost frozen in time. When officers stepped inside, they found Bernice Worden's body hanging upside down from the ceiling. She had been dressed out like a deer, but that wasn't the worst discovery. As they searched the house, they realized almost nothing inside was ordinary. Bowls made from human skulls, chairs upholstered with human skin, lampshades, masks, belts, even boxes filled with preserved body parts. Investigators first believed Gein had murdered dozens of people. The truth was somehow stranger. He admitted to digging up freshly buried corpses from local cemeteries. He stole their bodies, then used their remains to build furniture, clothing, and what he called a woman's suit. He believed that by wearing it, he could become his dead mother. Despite the horrors inside the farmhouse, police could only prove he murdered 2 women. Everything else had come from the graves of the dead. The investigation horrified the entire country. Reporters struggled to describe what officers had witnessed. Many refused to print the full details. Some photographs taken inside the house have never been forgotten by the investigators who saw them. Ed Gein spent the rest of his life inside a mental institution. He died in 1984, but his crimes never truly disappeared. His obsession inspired some of the most terrifying fictional killers ever created, including Norman Bates, Leatherface, and Buffalo Bill. One disturbed man changed horror forever. Some monsters chased their victims. Ed Gein waited until they were already buried, and somehow, that may be even worse. Like and subscribe to Red Frequency TV for more True Red Horror Files. Remember, don't watch alone. True Red Horror Files. Episode 9. David Berkowitz, New York City. The summer of 1976, a city already drowning in fear, was about to meet a nightmare with a gun. His name was David Berkowitz. The world would come to know him as the son of Sam, but before the headlines, before the manhunt, he looked like someone you'd pass without a second thought. A postal worker, quiet, forgettable, living an ordinary life while secretly feeding violent fantasies no one around him could see. Then the shootings began. Young couples sitting in parked cars, late-night conversations cut short by the sound of a .44 caliber revolver. Victims were chosen almost at random. Some survived, many didn't. With every attack, panic spread deeper through New York. People stopped going out at night. Couples avoided secluded streets. Women with long dark hair even cut or dyed it after rumors spread that they were being specifically targeted. Police chased thousands of leads. Nothing stuck. Then the killer did something that changed everything. He started writing letters, cold, mocking. He taunted investigators and the media, signing them with a name the world would never forget. Son of Sam. One letter claimed he was obeying orders from a demon speaking through his neighbor's dog. Whether he truly believed it or used it to confuse investigators is still debated. But one thing wasn't. People were terrified. The killings continued. Pressure on police became overwhelming. Then, a simple parking ticket changed history. After the final shooting, detectives noticed a car parked near the crime scene had recently received a citation. The owner? David Berkowitz. When investigators searched his vehicle, they found weapons, maps, and evidence connecting him to the murders. On August 10, 1977, the hunt was over. During questioning, Berkowitz confessed to the shootings with chilling calmness. The monster New York had feared for more than a year wasn't hiding in the shadows anymore. He was sitting in an interrogation room. In total, David Berkowitz murdered 6 people and wounded several others, leaving scars on an entire city that would last for generations. His story remains one of America's most infamous serial killer cases, not just because of the murders, but because he turned fear itself into a weapon. Some monsters don't wear masks. Sometimes they wait beside you at a red light, and you never know they're there until it's too late. Like, subscribe to Red Frequency TV for more true horror, disturbing cases, and terrifying stories. And remember, don't watch alone. True Red Horror Files, Episode 10, The Zodiac Killer, Northern California, 1968. A killer was hunting strangers in the dark. There was no warning, no known connection between the victims, no clear reason why they were chosen. And when police began searching for answers, the killer did something almost unheard of. He turned the investigation into a public performance. On December 20th, 1968, 2 teenagers, Betty Lou Jensen and David Faraday, were attacked near Lake Herman Road. Jensen was killed. Faraday was shot and survived only moments. Months later, another couple was attacked at Blue Rock Springs. Darlene Ferrin was killed. Her companion, Michael Merjo, survived. Then came the letters. In 1969, newspapers began receiving messages from a man calling himself the Zodiac. He claimed responsibility for the attacks, threatened more killings, and demanded that his letters and ciphers be published. One cipher contained hundreds of symbols. For decades, people tried to uncover what was hidden inside. In 2020, a team of codebreakers finally solved the infamous 340-character cipher, but the message did not reveal his name. Instead, it revealed something far more disturbing. The killer was still playing with the people hunting him. The Zodiac's crimes continued. At first, investigators were chasing a murderer. Soon, they were also chasing a voice. A man who seemed to enjoy watching police, reporters, and the public argue over every clue he left behind. At Lake Berryessa, a man wearing a distinctive hood approached students Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard. He tied them up, then attacked them with a knife. Hartnell survived. Shepard did not. Days later, the Zodiac claimed the attack in another letter. Then, on October 11th, 1969, San Francisco cab driver Paul Stein picked up a passenger. He would never make it home. Stein was shot in the head. The killer took a piece of his shirt and mailed it to a newspaper as proof. Police came close. A witness even saw the suspect walking away, but the man disappeared into the night. After that, the letters became less frequent. Then they stopped. No arrest, no confession, no confirmed photograph, no final moment when investigators could point to a man and say, "This is him." And the Zodiac Killer was never identified. 5 people are officially attributed to the Zodiac's murders, though he claimed many more. His real name remains unknown, his face remains uncertain, and somewhere inside thousands of pages of evidence, investigators still search for the answer to one question: who was the Zodiac? Because the most terrifying part of this case isn't that a killer vanished, it's that after nearly 60 years, we still don't know where the story ends. Red Files, Episode 11, Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer. In the summer of 1982, something was terribly wrong in Washington state. Bodies were appearing near the Green River. The victims were mostly young women, many of them runaways or women living on the margins of society. At first, investigators didn't know who they were looking for. They only knew that someone was hunting them. His name was Gary Leon Ridgway, and for years, he looked like the kind of man nobody would remember. A husband, a father, a man who went to work. But behind that ordinary life was a killer who would eventually confess to murdering dozens of women. Ridgway became known as the Green River Killer because several of his earliest victims were discovered near the river. The investigation grew into one of the largest murder investigations in Washington history. But the killer remained free. Years passed, then decades, and Ridgway kept living his life. Investigators had questioned him before. In 1987, police collected biological samples from him, but the technology wasn't ready to connect him to the murders. Then DNA changed everything. In 2001, investigators finally had the evidence they needed. Gary Ridgway was arrested at the Kenworth factory where he worked. The man investigators had been hunting for nearly 20 years had been standing among ordinary people the entire time. But the most disturbing part came after his arrest. In 2003, Ridgway pleaded guilty to 48 counts of aggravated murder. During the investigation, he told detectives he had killed so many women that he had difficulty keeping them straight. He received 48 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. But the case wasn't finished. In 2011, investigators recovered the remains of Rebecca Marrero, a 20-year-old woman who had disappeared in 1982. Ridgway pleaded guilty to her murder too. That brought a confirmed number of murders he pleaded guilty to in King County to 49. And even after all those answers, some women connected to the Green River investigation remain missing. That's what makes the Green River case so disturbing. Not just the number, not just the years he remained free, but the fact that the man investigators were searching for wasn't hiding in some dark basement. He was living an ordinary life in plain sight. And somewhere in Washington, families were still waiting for answers. This is Red Files. And sometimes, the most frightening monsters don't look like monsters at all. Episode 12. Charles Manson, the man who made others kill. Red Frequency TV, True Red Horror Files. There are killers who act alone, and then there are killers who act alone. Charles Manson was one of the most infamous examples in American history. Born in 1934, Manson spent much of his early life moving through institutions and prison cells. But by the late 1960s, he had gathered a group of young followers around him in California. They called him their leader. Manson called himself a prophet, but behind the music, the drugs, and the strange philosophy was something far more disturbing: control. He convinced his followers that he understood a coming racial apocalypse he called Helter Skelter. Then in August 1969, the nightmare became real. On the night of August 8th, members of Manson's group entered the Los Angeles home of actress Sharon Tate. Tate was 8 months pregnant. She and 4 other people were murdered. The following night, Manson followers carried out another series of killings at the home of Leno and Rosemary LaBianca. The victims were not chosen because of some personal feud. They were caught inside a world created by someone else. And that may be the most frightening part of the entire story. Manson did not need to personally commit every murder to leave bodies behind. He had convinced others that violence was part of a greater purpose. Investigators eventually connected the killings to Manson and his followers. His trial became one of the most infamous criminal proceedings of the 20th century. Manson was convicted of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. He was sentenced to death, but California's death penalty was later overturned, and his sentence became life imprisonment. Manson spent the rest of his life behind bars. He died in prison in 2017. But Charles Manson's story isn't frightening because he was some supernatural monster. It's frightening because he was human. He understood loneliness. He understood influence. And he understood how badly some people wanted someone to tell them that their lives had a purpose. That is the true horror of Charles Manson. The monster wasn't hiding in the dark. He was standing in front of people, talking, and they listened. This is Red Frequency TV. Don't watch alone. True Red Horror File. Episode 13. Edmund Kemper. Some killers disappear into the darkness. Edmund Kemper barely needed to. In 1964, when Kemper was only 15, he shot and killed his grandparents in California. He was sent to a state hospital where psychiatrists evaluated him for years. Then, at 21, he was released on parole. That decision would become one of the darkest chapters in California criminal history. Kemper returned to Santa Cruz County and built an ordinary-looking life. He worked and attended community college. To some people, he seemed quiet, intelligent, and approachable. But underneath that image, something was getting worse. Beginning in May 1972, Kemper started picking up young women who were hitchhiking. Over the next several months, 6 young women were murdered. Mary Ann Pess, Anita Luchessa, Aiko Koo, Cindy Shull, Rosalind Thorpe, and Alice Liu. The pattern was horrifyingly simple. He would offer them a ride. They trusted him. They never made it home. Investigators struggled to identify the killer. Kemper lived in the same community and moved through everyday life without immediately attracting suspicion. Then, in April 1973, the killings took a deeply personal turn. Kemper killed his mother, Clarnell Strandberg, and her friend, Sally Hallett. Then something unexpected happened. Instead of disappearing, Kemper left California and traveled to Colorado. From Pueblo, he called the Santa Cruz police and told them he had committed the murders. At first, officers struggled to believe him. Why would a killer voluntarily call the police? But the details he provided began matching evidence. Kemper was arrested, returned to California, and charged with 8 counts of first-degree murder. 3 court-appointed psychiatrists found him legally sane. In November 1973, he was convicted and sentenced to 8 concurrent life sentences. The case left behind a question that still makes this story disturbing. How did someone who had already killed his grandparents at 15 eventually walk free? Kemper's story is not frightening because he looked like a monster. It is frightening because he didn't. He could appear calm, intelligent, cooperative, even helpful. And that is the lesson buried inside the file. Evil does not always announce itself. Sometimes it learns how to blend in. Edmund Kemper remains incarcerated at the California Medical Facility in Vacaville. He has repeatedly been denied parole, most recently in 2024. More than 5 decades later, investigators and psychologists still study the case to understand how warning signs were missed. This is the part of the story that should stay with you. Authorities first encountered Kemper as a murderer, and they still eventually let him walk out. This was the True Red Horror File, Episode 13. And if you think you've heard the worst case Red Frequency TV has covered, you haven't seen the next file. That failure would haunt investigators long after his arrest. The Murder Castle, H. Holmes, Chicago, 1893. The city was preparing to show the world its future. Millions of people arrived for the World's Columbian Exposition, filling hotels, streets, and boarding houses with strangers who had no reason to know one another. One man understood exactly how useful that could be. His name was Herman Webster Mudgett. History would remember him as H. Holmes. Holmes was intelligent, charming, and exceptionally deceptive. He studied medicine, changed his name, moved frequently, and built a life around manipulation and fraud. But the darkest part of his story was a building in Chicago that later became known as the Murder Castle. Holmes purchased property near the fairgrounds and constructed a strange 3-story building filled with businesses, apartments, and rooms designed around his own plans. Some rooms were difficult to escape, helping create the legends surrounding the building. But separating fact from later sensational stories is important. The famous claims that Holmes installed gas lines to poison dozens of guests, or that hundreds of people died inside the building, were exaggerated by newspapers and retellings. His victim count remains uncertain. What is certain is that Holmes was a serial killer. Among those connected to him were Julia and Pearl Connor, Emmeline Sigrand, and Minnie and Nanny Williams. Holmes used relationships, deception, money, and trust as weapons. He did not need to look like a monster. That may be the most disturbing part. He could smile. He could speak calmly. He could convince people that they were safe. Then, in 1894, Holmes' world began collapsing. His crimes unraveled through an insurance fraud scheme involving Benjamin Pitezel. Pitezel was killed, and Holmes attempted to deceive the people closest to him while covering his tracks. Investigators eventually followed the trail. Holmes was arrested, and once authorities began examining the evidence, the charming doctor became something else entirely. a man facing the consequences of years of calculated deception. He was convicted of Puttezel's murder and sentenced to death. On May 7, 1896, H. Holmes was hanged in Philadelphia. Even at the end, he reportedly remained controlled. Holmes left behind one question that still follows his name. How many people did he actually kill? The answer may never be known. The murder castle itself was destroyed after Holmes' death, erasing much of the physical evidence that might have helped separate truth from legend. And that is what makes H. Holmes so unsettling, not the exaggerated stories. The documented reality is frightening enough. A man built a life around lies, gained trust, and turned relationships into opportunities for murder. The castle became a legend, but the man was real, and beneath the headlines is a darker truth. The most dangerous monsters do not always look dangerous. Sometimes, they look like the person you just decided to trust. True Red Horror Files, Episode 15, Albert Fish. Good evening. Welcome to Red Frequency TV, where the signal is weak, but the stories are real. This is True Red Horror Files, Episode 15. Tonight, Albert Fish. In the early 1900s, New York had a killer who could disappear into plain sight. His name was Hamilton Howard Fish, better known as Albert Fish. He was born in 1870 and presented himself as an ordinary elderly man. Behind that appearance was a history of violence, abuse, and disturbing crimes against children. Fish became connected to several disappearances, including 8-year-old Frances McDonnell in 1924 and 4-year-old Billy Gaffney in 1927. But the case that finally exposed him began in June 1928. 10-year-old Grace Budd lived with her family in Manhattan. Fish approached her parents under the name Frank Howard, claiming he was a farmer, and inviting Grace to a birthday party for a relative. Her parents allowed her to go. Grace never came home. For 6 years, her disappearance remained unsolved. Then, in November 1934, Grace's mother, Delia Budd, received an anonymous letter. The writer described what had happened to Grace and included details investigators believed only her killer could have known. Detective William King traced a crucial clue on the envelope: its printed letterhead. That trail led police to Albert Fish. On December 13, 1934, Fish was arrested in New York City. Investigators searched a property called Wisteria Cottage in Westchester County. There, they recovered remains that were identified as Grace Budd. Fish was taken to trial in March 1935. His defense argued insanity. Prosecutors presented the letter, the confession, and physical evidence connecting him to Grace's murder. The jury rejected the insanity defense. Albert Fish was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death, but the case revealed something even darker. Fish was questioned about other children, and authorities connected him to the deaths or disappearances of Frances McDonnell and Billy Gaffney. Investigators believed there may have been additional victims, although the exact number remains uncertain. On January 16, 1936, at Sing Sing Prison, Albert Fish was led into the execution chamber. He was 65 years old. At 11:06 that night, the electric chair was activated. 3 minutes later, Albert Fish was dead. His story remains one of the most disturbing criminal cases in American history. Not because the killer looked like a monster, but because he didn't. He looked ordinary, and for years, that was enough to keep the truth hidden. This was episode 15 of True Red Horror Files. Like, subscribe, and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. And remember, Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one nobody notices. True Red Horror Files, Episode 16, Belle Gunness. Good evening. Welcome to Red Frequency TV, where the signal is weak, but the stories are real. Tonight, we're going back to the early 1900s and the story of a woman who may have turned murder into a business. Her name was Belle Gunness. Born in Norway, Belle eventually moved to America and settled in Indiana. From the outside, she looked like an ordinary woman building a life, but men around her had a disturbing habit of dying. Her first husband died under suspicious circumstances. Belle collected the insurance money. Then another husband died. Again, Belle received money. Eventually, Belle began placing advertisements looking for wealthy men who wanted marriage. The men were told to bring their money with them. Some traveled to her farm in LaPorte, Indiana, and some were never seen again. In 1908, Belle's farmhouse burned to the ground. Inside, investigators discovered the bodies of Belle's 3 children. They also found the body of a woman believed to be Belle. But something wasn't right. The body didn't appear to match Belle's physical characteristics, and Belle herself was nowhere to be found. Then investigators searched the property. They discovered human remains buried around the farm. Some were believed to belong to men who had disappeared after answering Belle's advertisements. The exact number of victims has never been confirmed, but investigators suspected Belle could have killed numerous people for their money. Then came the biggest mystery. Was Belle really the woman who died in that fire, or had she staged her own death? Reports of Belle being spotted began appearing across the country, but none of those sightings were ever conclusively proven, and Belle Gunness was never definitively found. More than a century later, we still don't know exactly what happened to her. A woman who promised lonely men love and a new life may have been leading them straight to their graves. This is the True Red Horror Files, and the question still remains. Did Belle Gunness die in that fire, or did she get away? Red Frequency TV. Don't watch alone. Red Horror Files, Episode 17, Jack the Ripper. Good evening. Welcome to Red Frequency TV, where the signal is weak, but the stories are real. London, 1888. In the poverty-stricken district of Whitechapel, a killer was stalking the streets after dark. His victims were women living on the margins of society. Their names were Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. The first of the murders traditionally linked to the killer began on August 31st, when Mary Ann Nichols was found dead on Bucks Row. Days later, Annie Chapman was murdered on Hunbury Street. Then, on September 30th, Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes were killed within the same night. London was terrified. Newspapers began reporting on a mysterious murderer haunting Whitechapel. Soon, a name appeared in letters supposedly sent by the killer, Jack the Ripper. But there was a problem. Nobody knew who he was. Hundreds of letters were eventually sent claiming to be from the Ripper, but many were considered hoaxes. Even today, investigators cannot prove which, if any, actually came from the murderer. Then came November 9th. Mary Jane Kelly was found murdered inside her room at Miller's Court. Her death is generally considered the final killing among the famous 5, and then the murders stopped. No arrest, no trial, no confirmed identity. The police investigated countless suspects, but the killer disappeared into history. Over the years, doctors, criminals, butchers, artists, and even members of the aristocracy were accused by theorists. But suspicion isn't proof. More than a century later, Jack the Ripper remains unidentified. The women he murdered became famous because of the man who killed them, but they were never just victims. They were human beings with lives, struggles, families, and stories of their own. And somewhere in the darkness of Victorian London, a killer walked away from the crime scenes and was never officially found. Jack the Ripper remains one of history's most infamous unsolved mysteries. And the question still remains, who was the man behind the name? True Red Horror Files, Episode 18, Robert Hansen, the Butcher Baker. Good evening. Welcome to Red Frequency TV, where the signal is weak, but the stories are real. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, women were disappearing from Anchorage, Alaska. At first, there didn't seem to be a connection. Some women simply vanished. Others were eventually found dead in remote areas. Then investigators began looking at one man. His name was Robert Hansen. On the surface, Hansen looked completely ordinary. He was a husband, a father, and a baker who owned a business in Anchorage. But behind that ordinary life was a horrifying secret. Hansen targeted women around Anchorage, including women who were vulnerable and living difficult lives. He would sometimes offer them rides or convince them to go with him. Then he would take them far away from the city. Some victims were taken into the Alaskan wilderness by plane, and according to investigators, Hansen would release them and hunt them. Imagine being stranded in one of the most isolated places on Earth, knowing that the person who brought you there was coming after you. For years, the disappearances continued. Then, in 1983, one woman escaped. Her name was Cindy Paulson. Paulson survived an attack by Hansen and managed to get away. She went to police and told investigators what had happened. Her testimony gave detectives a crucial break. Investigators began digging into Hansen's background and searching his property. They uncovered evidence connecting him to multiple missing women. The investigation revealed a much larger pattern than anyone initially suspected. Hansen eventually confessed to killing 17 women. Authorities believed there could have been additional victims. In 1984, Hansen pleaded guilty to 4 murders and received a sentence totaling hundreds of years, plus life imprisonment. But catching Hansen didn't end the mystery. Some of his victims remained unidentified for decades. One woman became known only as Horseshoe Harriet after her remains were discovered near Horseshoe Lake. For years, nobody knew her real name. Then in 2021, investigators finally identified her as Robin Pelkey. She was only 19 years old when she disappeared. After nearly 4 decades, her family finally had an answer. Robert Hansen died in prison in 2014, but the most important part of this case isn't the killer, it's the women he tried to erase. They had families, they had friends, they had futures. Hansen wanted the wilderness to swallow their stories. It didn't. Decades later, investigators were still finding answers and giving victims their names back. Robert Hansen became known as the Butcher Baker, but the women he murdered were more than victims in a case file. They were people who deserved to come home. This was Robert Hansen, and this is another file from Red Frequency TV's True Red Horror Files. Don't watch alone. Episode 19, Richard Kuklinski. Good evening. Welcome to Red Frequency TV, where the signal is weak, but the stories are real. Episode 19, Richard Kuklinski. Before he became known as the Iceman, Richard Kuklinski looked like an ordinary family man living in New Jersey. He was married, had children, went to work, and lived in a suburban neighborhood. But behind that normal life was a man who committed some of the most disturbing murders connected to organized crime. Kuklinski claimed he began killing when he was young, and later said he became a contract killer for mob figures. He earned the nickname the Iceman because he reportedly froze one victim's body to confuse investigators about the time of death. For years, Kuklinski maintained a terrifying double life. At home, he could appear to be a husband and father. Outside that house, investigators said he was involved in murder, violence, and criminal activity. His reputation grew because of the stories he told about his killings. He claimed to have murdered dozens of people, sometimes saying the number was more than 100. But not every claim was ever proven, and investigators have questioned parts of his story. What is known is already disturbing enough. In 1986, investigators finally brought Kuklinski down after an undercover operation. He was arrested and later convicted of multiple murders. He received a life sentence, but the story became even darker after his arrest. Kuklinski gave interviews from prison, describing his crimes with a chilling calmness. He spoke about murder as if it were simply another part of his life. That may be the most disturbing part of Richard Kuklinski's story. Not the nickname, not the body count he claimed, but the fact that a man accused of killing people could return home, sit at the dinner table, and continue living as if nothing had happened. Richard Kuklinski died in prison in 2006. The Iceman was gone, but the questions surrounding how many people he actually killed remain frozen in the dark. And there was another side to the case that made Kuklinski so difficult to understand. The public image of the Iceman was built partly through his own words. He presented himself as an unstoppable professional killer, but investigators could only prove a fraction of the murders he claimed. That distinction matters. True crime can turn a killer's confession into mythology. Kuklinski's interviews became famous because of how casually he described violence, but his claims about working for mafia families and carrying out numbers of contract killings remain heavily disputed. Still, the murders tied to him were real. His victims were people whose lives ended violently, while Kuklinski maintained the appearance of a family life. Sometimes evil does not look like a monster. Sometimes it looks like the person nobody thought to fear. This has been episode 19 of The Red Files. Red Frequency TV, True Red Horror Files, Episode 20, Israel Keys. Good evening. Welcome to Red Frequency TV. For 20 episodes, we've opened some of the darkest files in true crime. Tonight, we close the file, and for the finale, we're ending with a killer whose greatest weapon wasn't rage, it was patience. His name was Israel Keys. Keys didn't fit the image people expected from a serial killer. He worked construction, traveled across the country, lived what appeared to be an ordinary life, but investigators later discovered that behind that normal appearance was something carefully calculated. Keys would travel hundreds or even thousands of miles, sometimes choosing victims completely at random. He buried what investigators called murder kits in different parts of the country, caches containing weapons, money, and other materials he could retrieve later. Then, in June 2011, he traveled to Vermont. He broke into the home of Bill and Lorraine Carrier. Both were kidnapped and murdered. Their bodies have never been found. But Keys made one mistake. In February 2012, He abducted 18-year-old Samantha Koenig from a coffee stand in Anchorage, Alaska. That crime would eventually bring his entire secret life crashing down. After killing Samantha, Keyes used her debit card and traveled across several states. Investigators followed the trail. On March 13, 2012, Israel Keyes was arrested in Texas, and that's when the case became even darker. During more than 40 hours of interviews, Keyes admitted that he had committed other murders. He gave investigators details about crimes across the country. He talked about victims who had never been identified. The FBI eventually believed Keyes was responsible for 11 homicides, but only 3 victims were conclusively identified. And then, Keyes took the answers with him. On December 2nd, 2012, while awaiting trial in an Anchorage jail, Israel Keyes died by suicide. Investigators later found writings beneath his body. They were examined by the FBI. There was no hidden code, no final confession, no list of names, nothing that could tell investigators who the remaining victims were. And that is what makes Israel Keyes one of the most haunting cases in American true crime. Not because investigators know everything, because they don't. Somewhere out there are families who may still have questions. Some victims may never receive their names back, and some stories may never be completely told. 20 episodes, 20 files, and this is where the signal ends. But remember, the darkest cases aren't always the ones with the most answers. Sometimes, the scariest thing is what we'll never know. This is Red Frequency TV. Don't watch alone.